Hello and welcome back to the Daily Update from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. I'm Captain Doug Hunter coming to you today on June the 4th, 2016. I'm happy to report that Friday was a rather routine day here in Wayne County for the deputies who responded to a variety of what I'd call routine calls. I don't have any real serious crimes to report to you today, but I do want to remind you that there are a number of activities taking place in the city of Worcester today, the first of which is right here at the Wayne County Justice Center. Kicking off at 10 a.m. is the Worcester Police Department's Bicycle Rodeo. Now, this is an event for young children to come and receive a free bicycle helmet and some instruction on bicycle safety. It's something they've done for many years, and it's a very popular event there at the Justice Center at 201 West North Street in Worcester. Afterwards, it's Kids Day down at the library, Wayne County Library. A number of activities taking place there. Sheriff Hutchinson will be on hand, so stop in and say hello. He's looking forward to seeing everybody. He told me to share that with you, and he'll have a cruiser there, and the kids can climb inside and check things out and so forth. Now, I oftentimes bring you information about heroin and addiction, and today is going to be one of those days. You see, I'm going to share with you a video that I recently recorded at a Wayne County Opiate Task Force meeting. Now, this is Dr. Nicole Labor, who is an addiction specialist, and she has a very interesting presentation on the topic to provide some insight into how people become addicted. Now, it's long. I'm going to tell you this now. It's nearly an hour long. Please do not try to watch the whole thing at one time. Break it down into sections so you can really give this topic the attention that it deserves. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Nicole Labor.
Thank you guys for having me. That was a nice introduction, Bobby. And I know that some of you have heard this lecture or some version of this lecture before, so I apologize for being repetitive, but hopefully it's like going to an AA meeting where you hear something new every time. The reason that I do this particular lecture is because we've all sort of had our eyes open to this idea that addiction is prevalent, and specifically the opiates has been a big deal because it seems to be affecting all communities, not just the inner cities or the communities that ultimately had been neglected in the past. It's affecting everyone. So everyone's eyes are kind of opened at this point. And what I find is that, if I come in and I give a lecture on opiate addiction or anything specific related to addiction, all the questions I get at the end seem to be related to the fact that people just don't understand the disease of addiction, okay? And I think that if you want to put together a task force, if you want to go after the disease, if you want to try to help make this better, you really need to understand why it's a disease. It's key, because if you don't get it, you're not going to be able to fix it. So Addiction 101, that's what this lecture is. This is all that fancy information that Bobby just shared with you. Okay, so addiction is a disease. And the way that we know this is in medicine, we use the disease model. It's a very simple model, but back in the days of the Greeks, they used a humoral model, which basically said we're going to tap into your brain and let all your blood out because that's going to get rid of demons. That was the model that they used. In modern medicine, we use a disease model, which basically says there's an organ, there's a defect in that organ for whatever reason, and you have symptoms because of it. That's how we classify it as a disease. So in diabetes, for example, the organ is the pancreas, the defect is decreased islet cells and insulin resistance, and the symptoms are coma, high blood sugar, eye disease, kidney disease, so forth, okay? So addiction is a brain disease, and the brain is really complicated, and there are not really very many good tests for the brain, and even neurologists and people who specialize in the brain and neurology really don't know that much about it. So it is really complicated, and when you start to get into things like looking at behavior, mental illness, thoughts, how we think, how we feel, I mean, all of that is occurring chemically in our brain, but explaining it or trying to understand it is extremely difficult. And the problem is when there's a disease in the brain, it manifests as behavior. So if you have a tumor in a certain part of your brain, it's going to affect your behavior. It may be a physical problem where you can't walk properly or use your arm, or it may be what appears to be a personality problem where you suddenly become angry or difficult or nice or whatever the opposite of what you're normally like is. So it's very difficult to get a handle on what's going on in the brain. There's two parts of the brain that we deal with in addiction, and those are the only two parts I'm going to focus on because that's all we really need to know. But we have the frontal cortex. That's the front part of our brain, okay? And that is the part that makes us us. That is the part where your personality is. That's where your morality, your spirituality, your willpower, your choice, everything that makes you you. So anytime you make a decision and you think, I know what I'm doing, I know me, I know my life, it's coming from your frontal cortex. The midbrain is deeper inside, and it is the survival brain. It is not conscious. You guys have no control over your midbrains at all. You have nothing to do with it. You can't tap into it. You can't control it. It acts immediately, and it is based entirely on survival. It's the life or death processing station. So that's where if you're walking in the woods and you encounter a bear and you suddenly know you have to fight or flight, you know, that you have to fight the bear, you have to run for your life, you have to play dead, you have to have some sort of reaction. The midbrain is what turns on and forces you to act in a way that it thinks will cause survival. So basically, the midbrain has three functions in most normal people. Eat, defend yourself, and procreate. That's all it does. It doesn't think, it doesn't rationalize, it doesn't say, I really want chocolate. It doesn't say, I hate my neighbor, I'm going to kill that person. It's just in survival situation. It knows that you need to eat food, you need to get calories to have energy to live. It knows you need water to survive. It knows that you have to kill something that's threatening you, and it knows that we have to procreate if we want to perpetuate the species. That's it. Drugs of abuse particularly, work in the midbrain. And in fact, the reason that the drugs that people abuse, they abuse, is because they work in the midbrain. So drugs that don't work in the midbrain are not the ones that people abuse. So there are things like your blood pressure medicine or even most of your antidepressants and things like that. They're not working in your midbrain. Drugs that people abuse work in the midbrain. And we know this because they were doing experiments on little mice, which have little tiny brains, and they were sticking these little tiny probes in the little tiny mice brain, and they were putting it into the frontal cortex because back in the 60s, they really believed that addiction had to do with your behavior and your morals, and it was a moral problem. So they're sticking these little probes in the frontal cortex of these mice, and when the mice pushed a lever, it would administer cocaine right into the frontal cortex. And what they found was these mice could care less. They didn't want it. They weren't pushing the lever. They were like, oh, just leave me alone. I want to play with the other mice. And, you know, they were being normal mice. Well, because a mouse brain is very small, obviously mistakes can be made, and inevitably one of those probes was pushed a little bit too far and it was into the midbrain. And that mouse pushed that lever to administer cocaine to its brain over and over and over to the point where it died because it wasn't eating, drinking, playing with other mice, doing anything else, doing any normal mouse behavior. It was just getting cocaine, and only because it was in the midbrain. Mice get addicted to drugs. That's what I just demonstrated. A mouse will use a drug to the point of its own death, not thinking about its family or its friends or what it's supposed to do as a mouse. It will just use the drug until it dies. So the midbrain, the part of the brain that's supposed to keep it alive, is the part of the brain that was telling it, keep doing this, okay? Mice don't have gods, mice are not sociopaths, they don't have bad parents, there's no mouse gangs. This is not a moral, ethical issue. So in addiction, in the disease of addiction, the drug use, the continued drug use actually hijacks this hierarchy in the midbrain. It actually tells your brain that the drug is the #1 means to survive. So when that little mouse was pushing that lever, it was doing so because the midbrain had convinced it that that was the ultimate survival, more important than eating or drinking, more important than procreating, more important than any other social activity. Use the drug. That was it. So I use this example a lot. If you, non-addicts, I'm assuming, most of you anyway, You're dying of thirst in the desert. Literally dying. You are on day 6. You haven't had any water in 6 days. Your body is dehydrated. You cannot survive another day without water. You're dying. And someone comes up to you with a big bottle of water and says, you can have this water, but if you take it, I'm going to take your job, your kids, your spouse, your house, your car, everything. There is not a single person in this room who is biologically able to refuse that water. Everyone here would take the water as a priority over everything else you value. And that is because in times of survival, the midbrain turns on and tells you, you must do this to survive. Forget everything else, this is survival. Once you drank that water and you felt better and your body realized, okay, we got some fluid in us now, your frontal cortex would come back on and start telling you like, well, maybe we could convince her to give us our kids back. Or you know what, I'm going to do this. And you start justifying and rationalizing and finding ways to make it okay that you took that water and try and figure out how to get your family back. So the disease of addiction, there is a line crossed. There has to be changes in the midbrain for the disease to occur. Okay, there are people, okay, there's our non-addicts, and these are, of course, people that have never used drugs, people that maybe just used in college, people that sometimes use drugs occasionally. These are social drinkers. And then there are people that just abuse the crap out of drugs. They really do. They use them all the time. They're, but they are not addicts. Okay? Because by definition, if you can use a drug for years and years and years every day and then stop without help and never look back, you did not have the change in your midbrain. You are not an addict. And these people make my life very difficult because every addict wants to be that. Every addict wants to be able to say, I don't need any help, I don't need any treatment, I'm just going to stop doing it and I'll be fine, because we all know Uncle Marty, who sits at Thanksgiving dinner and says, I used crystal meth for 10 straight years and put it down, never looked at it again, all you need is some good willpower. Well, that is very, very difficult to argue against, except for the fact that Uncle Marty perhaps genetically didn't have the gene for addiction. Perhaps he didn't use long enough to trigger the changes in his midbrain. But for that person, the drug was still having an effect in the frontal cortex and the midbrain. There was no change to the midbrain to tell it that that drug was survival for that person. Now, we can't tell the difference just looking at two people. You're an addict, you're not an addict, you're just a bad drug abuser. So we do treat everyone in the same way as if they were addicts. But this, and I only put this slide in here to help people understand that one, just because someone uses or abuses drugs does not make them an addict, and two, just because someone was able to put it down, walk away, and never look at it again does not mean that everyone can do that, okay? And oftentimes what I find is that people like this Uncle Marty will say, I used crystal meth every day for 10 years and I put it down and never looked at it again. And you think, oh, well, he's doing well, but he's having a glass of wine with Thanksgiving dinner. And so the question becomes, well, how often are you drinking wine? Are you prescribed Xanax or Percocet or something else that has taken the place of the original drug that has allowed you to not use it? So it becomes a very complex issue. So we look at brain scans. We do have brain scans. They can look at different areas of your brain lighting up. So we tell you to think about something pleasant, a certain part of your brain lights up. We have you smell something, a part of your brain lights up. We can tell in this PET scans. They're very expensive though. So they're used primarily for cancer and they're used for research purposes. And in some of the research that's being conducted today on addiction, what they are able to show is people like our Uncle Marty, if you put him in a PET scan and you put a true addict in a PET scanner and you show them both their drug of choice, Uncle Marty's frontal cortex will light up because he's thinking about the drug. He's either remembering how awesome it was, oh, I had such a great time with that drug, or he's thinking about how terrible it was, oh my God, my life was a mess because of that. But the addict frontal cortex goes dark and their midbrain lights up. Because at that point, the changes have occurred in their midbrain, and that's the part of their brain that's driving their use. You can see this on scans. Addiction is a disorder in the brain's reward system.